Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome to ClimaTalk's last event of 2021. My name is Katrina Flesher. I am the events coordinator for the COP26, now the COP27 team at ClimaTalk. And today, as I'm sure you know, you are joining us for our COP26 evaluation event. So today we're going to be reflecting on those limitations and developments at COP26, and also reflecting on how we ourselves as youth activists can make a difference in climate activism and climate policy, particularly in the run-up to COP27, but of course just going forward as well. Today, I am joined by a brilliant panel of speakers who you will be hearing much more from in the next hour or so. We're going to be talking about their views on COP26, their work, and as I say, their views on what you guys can do as youth activists to generate meaningful change in climate action. As we go through the next hour, please do feel free to drop your messages and your questions in the chat, either just sort of to everyone, or you're welcome to direct them at me, because I'd really love to hear what you guys are most interested about and how you can kind of like maximize this time with our brilliant speakers to learn from them and to learn all about them. So we are recording this event, so just a sort of a final reminder from me to keep your cameras off and yourselves muted, but I will be spotlighted throughout, so there won't be any recording of participants. So before we get to hearing from our speakers, I wanted to give a sort of a brief introduction to ClimaTalk and to what COP is. So first, you know, the role and the mission of ClimaTalk. I'm sure you're all familiar with the organisation because you are indeed here this evening. But ClimaTalk is a youth-run non-profit organisation which seeks to demystify climate policy and amplify young people's voices in the fight against the climate crisis. As I say, I am the events coordinator on the COP26, COP27 team. So my focus is very much on events, but we do a plethora of activities to seek youth empowerment and youth education when it comes to climate policy. So, you know, fully referenced analysis articles, social media posts, to events like today. And we also had the privilege to have our president, Emma, and our two COP team interns, Jack and Charlie, attend COP26 on behalf of ClimaTalk. Who were spreading our message of education, youth inclusion, and youth empowerment at the climate conference, and also had the opportunity to learn from fascinating people like our speakers today there. I will come on to speaking about our speakers in just a moment. First of all, I just want to give a brief background on what we're talking about when we talk about COP26. We're going to be throwing around phrases like COP, COP26, COP27, UNFCCC a lot in the next hour or so. So I thought this kind of like foundational chat about what really we're talking about might be useful, indeed for everyone, but for particularly those who perhaps are just getting started in youth climate activism. So the UNFCCC is, as you can see on the slide here, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this was agreed at the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro by 154 countries and the EU. And the UNFCCC came into effect in 1994. This convention on climate change is now signed by over 190 countries. And each of those countries are known as a party to the convention. So, you know, today there are 197 parties to the UNFCCC, signatories of the UNFCCC. And COP quite simply stands for the Conference of Parties. And it's the UNFCCC platform for international cooperation on matters related to the climate crisis. With the exception of 2020, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, COP meets annually to act as the UNFCCC decision-making body, to monitor progress towards climate change targets, monitor emissions, and to promote further climate change ambition. So As you all know, today we are focusing on the 26th COP, COP26, but it's worth noting there are also COPs related to the UN Convention to Combat Desertification and the Convention of Biological Diversity. As you will all know, I am sure, COP26 occurred at a time when scientific projections for climate change are becoming increasingly urgent, as they have been for decades. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN scientific body on climate change, described its current reports as Code Red for Humanity in August 2021. So we're talking about this at an especially urgent time for the climate crisis. COP26 came at that especially urgent moment, but certainly the urgency on the climate crisis has been lacking and has been, there for some decades now. That's a bit of a background. That's a bit of a kind of like foundational description of where we're going to meet one another right now in this discussion. To facilitate our discussions on COP26, as I said, we are going to be joined by 4 youth activists who attended COP themselves. It is a real pleasure to have all 4 of you with us. I think I'll end my slide sharing now. I think I'll let everyone see all of our faces again, because it's a little bit more familiar. But if you could introduce yourselves, speakers, in the order that you're on the slide. So Michael, Melissa, Paula, and then Prayank. And then we will get into our discussions. So Michael, if you would like to take the floor and introduce yourself to our lovely audience.
Hi. I'm Michael from Austria. It's a pleasure to meet you all. I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards and now to the discussion on the panel. Yeah, I'm Michael, Youth Delegate for Austria. Youth Delegate means that we have 2 people in Austria, 2 young people in Austria who are part at the conference in Glasgow at the COPs every year. And we go to the COPs as a part of the official country delegation, where there's also negotiators and also other representatives of different organizations like economy and civil society and others. Yeah, and I am very deeply engaged in Fridays for Future in Austria and in the ONG, which is called Climate Austria. Climate Austria is also the organization which runs the program with the help of the climate ministry in Austria. And it also exists in other countries. Probably you've heard about it. Shall I continue? Yeah, I think that's the most important thing for the first.
Yeah, I think that's a great introduction. Thank you very much, Michael. I think, Melissa, your turn to take the floor now.
Thank you, Katrina. Thanks for the invitation and happy to be here. My name is Melissa Capcha. I'm from Peru and I am an environmental engineer, which from the very beginning was involved in many activities related to environmental issues and lately climate protection in my country, Peru. And in 2018, I founded an NGO here in Peru, and that's why I'm related to the climate conference more deeply. But since you might know, I am participating also in the climate conference since 2015, actively being part of the Peruvian delegation as a representative of the civil society organization here, because the organization that I found and in the past also working in this topic in adaptation and education, and raising awareness about that. And yeah, so I've been involved in many activities since that time, and now living in Germany also, I've become involved in many other activities that arise here in the European Union and also in some parts of the East, which is amazing for me because it helps me to understand the big panorama, how politics works, how this can be also reacted or be a problem for the Latin American countries or the global South specifically. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Paula, I think it was you next.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's really great to be here. I am Paula, so I'm the External Relations Officer at Youth and Environment Europe. Youth and Environment Europe is the largest independent European network of environmental youth organizations and it focuses mainly on the mission to raise awareness among young people on environmental issues, but also pave the way for their interaction within the decision-making process. And alongside being a board member for them, was also one of the delegates for COP26, which I attended for the second week. I was particularly interested in the topics of cities and gender, which were covered in these days, and so it was the most valuable experience for me. And just generally, I started volunteering in Youth and Environment Europe a bit over a year ago. And aside from that, I am also a student in politics and international relations, and I am interested in law and societal change. And I'm now based in the UK. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Prayank, do you want to finish off our round of introductions?
Yes, hello all. Hi, this is Prayank Jain from Delhi, New Delhi, India. First of all, it's a pleasure to be in the company of such promising and glorious folks, who are pursuing environmental conservation, from different lenses and different regions. A little about me: I'm a lawyer focusing on the human rights and climate change aspects. I currently work at an Indian climate policy think tank called the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW. And I was at COP26 as a delegate of CEEW and the Indian Youth Climate Network. I previously worked with similar organizations and initiatives around, teaching environmental law and, doing things around climate conservation, but also trying to build the right kind of strategies we need to get the action going. So very excited to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And thank you all for helping our attendees get to know you a little bit. So for our first section, I thought we could have a little bit of a conversation about what it was like going to COP26, because that's, something that I'm hugely interested to hear about, so I can have a bit of a kind of vicarious experience through you guys. And I think our audience will feel that hugely as well. But also just to more broadly talk about, why did you go to COP26? What were you doing there? And what was your kind of experience on the ground? I know that's quite a broad question, but take it as you will, take it with what you would like, because I think for most of our attendees who haven't gone to COP26 themselves, it will be really interesting to hear about what you actually do there and what it's actually like to be there. So Melissa, I was wondering if you could start us off talking about that a bit.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. So yeah, it was, of course, something I would say I can describe like with many feelings, because, the last year it was the COP26 was canceled. So therefore, this year was especially important for me, for the team I'm working with, and also to represent the government. It was very important for me because we knew that we were in a special time, not just because of COVID, but also because, for example, the new report of the IPCC, which was released this year also, it was creating a very clear panorama about the urgency that we are living on because of climate change. So it was for sure an opportunity that I received from the Peruvian government to participate, but also I didn't doubt any minute to prepare myself during the whole year, to follow again, to update myself in what was going on, the rule book of the Paris Agreement, and to also create my own agenda, and the agenda that can represent indigenous, also women, and especially the adaptation topic, which is very important for our country. We were very looking forward to what the discussions in Glasgow were finally landing on, because we were very following this topic since COP20, which was celebrated in Lima. So yeah, it was a mixture of feelings, to be honest. It was the first time after so many times of the lockdown here, and it was an interesting event. I cannot at the end say that it was not really meaningful for Peruvians and also for countries from the Latin America, because the results, even if there was it needed more ambitious, but at the end, I guess we were achieving something that we were looking for the past years. Mm-hmm.
No, thank you very much for that. Really interesting. And I think I'll kind of move on to Michael now, if that's okay, just a bit, and the same question again, just kind of what did you do at COP26? Why were you there? And what was that experience like?
Yeah, to your previous question, I think if you come to the COP, the first impression is that you're completely overwhelmed by the size and by the many different people who are there. For me, it's a bit difficult or weird that you stand there and there are hundreds of people walking beside you, and you do not know at all whether those people are in favor of bringing forward solutions for the climate action, or if they just came to the COP to block them. And yeah, our role officially was to represent the voice of the youth in Glasgow. But if we are serious, that's quite difficult, because the position of the EU is already fixed some months before the COP in a very intransparent negotiation among the member states. So we must ask ourselves, what can we achieve at the COP? And I think our main lever is to communicate what happens there towards press in Austria and in the rest of Europe, because in the end, we as young people have to put pressure on the politicians in our national countries, so that they bring those ambition to the EU level in my case, and to the UN level in the second place. So we concentrated on media interviews and making press releases and so on, and talk with some politicians and negotiators in Glasgow who are much deeper in the process than we are. And unfortunately, due to COVID, we were not even able to join the negotiations themselves in the past years. That was possible, and we hope that it will be better next year again, so that also young people and NGOs can be part of the negotiations, or at least listen to the negotiations in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a grievance I recall talking about during COP26, and it's no doubt something we will absolutely come on to when we talk about the limitations of the conference and what needs to be changed going forward, is that presence in the room of people who are more ambitious on climate policy changes, and indeed will be more impacted by the climate crisis. So yeah, thank you both for those answer those questions. I mean, Prayank and Paula, you both did youth representation at COP26, so I don't know who leads on most simply from Michael, but Prayank, why don't you take the floor next about kind of what capacity you went to COP26 in, and what your experience was like with what you did there.
Right. Thank you. First of all, I went as a delegate of two different organizations, the one that I'm employed with, the council, and also the Indian Youth Climate Network, which is a youth climate network within India doing a lot of capacity building work. I very strongly echo what Michael said, that you get completely overwhelmed by the size and the scale of COP. This was my first COP, and I went to the plan to that I'll cover the negotiations, I will track things, I'll meet people, I'll do networking, and I'll of course contribute to different working groups and the youth networks. The moment you go there, you realize that you can do only one of these things properly, because the size is such that either you can effectively cover a particular issue like loss and damage, Article 6, or green hydrogen throughout the COP and be on top of it, or you can do bits and pieces, attending youth protests, attending plenaries, looking at side events, different pavilions, things like that. So it was very overwhelming, and it was very clear in day 2 or day 1 for me that you need to have a very clear agenda of what is your issue and how are you going to track it, and then consequently you build your work plan around it. So in this capacity, I went to COP, and my goal was to get the maximum flavor and experience of what is happening at the COP, meet with negotiators, meet with other people who I know, and try to understand what's happening on the other side of the room, which is the negotiating room. Apart from that, it was also a little crazy because we were testing every day for COVID. And it was very crazy because you see 50,000 people across a period of 2 weeks, entering, everybody running around from one place to the other. And you want to meet people, but you need to create those segments for yourself, because otherwise you'll just end up saying hi to people because there's so many people across. But I think I'll pause here and I'll let the other panelists come in.
No, that's very good of you, but that was all really, really interesting to hear, Prayank. So thank you very much for that. I certainly, even as someone who wasn't at COP, felt that kind of overwhelm of information, the fact that you want to know everything about everything that's happening and it's truly unachievable. I can't imagine how much more intense that must feel when you're actually there and the people are actually there in front of you. So to round off our kind of like those first discussions about kind of like what we were and what you did at COP26 and what your experience was like there. Paula, do you want to take it away and talk a bit about what you did and how you found it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I will also mostly echo what has been said before. A lot of really valid points on how incredibly bleak the place was and incredibly overwhelming. But maybe talking more about generally why I was there to begin with. Obviously, I was there when representing my organization together with other members of my delegations. And we had been interested in COP for a while, and obviously also in seeing how COP26 will allow us to expand our work also more deeply into policy, which was incredibly interesting for us from a youth perspective. And I think definitely the opportunity allowed us to reach different people and also gain the specificities of the work that otherwise we wouldn't have had. I specifically was very eager to go to COP because I thought it was important for my role and the necessity of finally having to meet in person. And I think that was possibly one of the things that defined my experience at COP, was being able to meet with the team of people that I'd only worked online so far of Youth and Environment Europe, but also our member organizations and their representatives, and kind of being able to just meet other youths that shared similar insights and that I hadn't had the opportunity so far to really meet in person. So I think that was the defining moment of my experience at COP, if I had to say it. And the other one, which I think has been echoed by everyone before, was also exhaustion. It was a very, very exhausting time. One, because of the amount of people, and also possibly the first real big event that I ever attended since COVID. And just the idea that now we were in front of so many people who had the power to do something, and kind of having to balance the feeling of empowerment and powerlessness at the same time. Yeah.
That's a really interesting way to close out, Paula, the balancing of feeling powerful and powerless at the same time. I think that's the story of a lot of kind of like youth engagement and youth collaboration, is this true like sort of the solidarity that you feel by kind of meeting those other groups and meeting those people with whom you've worked so extensively on climate activism, but then running into the limitations we've talked about before in terms of what you can actually do on the day at COP26 as well. So hopefully for our audience, that's a little bit more of a kind of background into our speakers, a bit more about what it's like to be at COP and what you actually do at the climate conference, which I think can feel as a bit more of a kind of concept to some people rather than a real life thing that people go to and lobby at and build their agendas at. So thank you all very much for conveying that to us. Moving a little bit more kind of solidly, I suppose, into sort of the policy developments at a sort of international climate policy level. It doesn't need to be international, climate policy level generally. I wondered if for our sort of second section of discussions, we could talk about moments of progress or optimism at COP26. So this could, as I say, cover, policy developments, but also kind of the work of particular NGOs or individuals or your own work that you found gave you kind of reason for confidence in progress at COP26. Especially with regard to any of that, but of course, climate policy, you're more than welcome to mention the limitations of those developments. But I think before we get on to kind of the limitations of COP26, it's important to discuss what was done there and what we can see as developments there. So Prayank, I have you in my notes as starting this section for no reason other than to have a rotation of the speakers. So feel free to take it away now on that.
Well, thank you for giving me the floor for this question, because I do want to, before talking about climate policy progress or limitations, I want to bring the point about narratives. I think COP26 was very closely defined by the narratives as to which media are you consuming, which is the agenda that you're pursuing. I come from India, and towards the end, the phase down and the phase out debate really changed the media coverage of COP26. But if you look at the larger announcements made by developing countries such as India, they're very ambitious. Now, I don't want to speak about India, but in the larger climate policy context, there were certain expectations that had to be met in the beginning of COP26 to make it a successful COP, which was resolving Article 6, which was getting climate finance on the table, for developing countries to mitigate and reduce coal and other emission creating systems, but also finance for loss and damage. Apart from these two, there were expectations that different developed countries will pick up issues. There will be action on how the UNFCCC will create new safeguards, new stock taking mechanisms, transparency, things like that. Without going into great details, the conversation about narratives is important because the COP is over and still people are like, was it a success or not? The fact that countries could wrestle and get into an agreement without extending the time is a success. But the fact that still that was a good enough thing, maybe, is it what the planet needs? Not, but it does put us on the course. So in that context, I think narratives are important. I will briefly put a spotlight on what India did, because I think that was what I was there for, to support the Indian delegation, not directly but indirectly with as knowledge partners, and also try to put forth the perspective of youth from India and other developing countries from the global south on that scale. I'll just take a minute more and say that India announced that it will reach net zero by 2070, which is pretty late from China, US, and other countries. But on a cumulative level, its per capita emissions will be much lower than all the other countries. But that being said, it said that by 2030, it will have 500 gigawatts of renewable capacity. It will generate 50% of the power through renewable sources and otherwise. Other countries, Vietnam, Bangladesh, also came up with strong commitments. South Africa received funding from UK, Australia, and other countries to move away from fossil fuels. So some elements of climate policy there. I'll let the other speakers come in as well. But key moments of progress, I think, was when big announcements were made by different countries on their net zero. Also, key moments of progress when non-state actors such as businesses launched different coalitions to move fast. And there was a breakthrough coalition of Glasgow, launched by the UK government, which showed that different industries are taking an action forward. I'll pause here, because other speakers, just like the carbon space, we should also be mindful of the talking space, not to hijack it.
That was quite an excellent analogy, really. Thank you very much for that, Prayank. And also just quickly to the audience, as we go through this, again, just to re-emphasize, please do send through questions if they come up. As I say, either just to the chat or directly to me. Because there's so much to get into and what we're talking about. So thank you very much again, Prayank. Michael, do you want to take over next to chat about your kind of moments of progress and optimism at COP26, those kind of developments?
I mean, I would have expected way more, or at least we should have seen way more to come to the 1.5 degrees target. I think there are some positive aspects. For example, that in the final paper, we clearly see that science is way more emphasized by the states than in previous final papers. There are also, as you already said, many pledges from national countries or on the bilateral or multilateral level, which can bring significant climate action in case that civil society and the media make the countries really deliver on that. I also want to highlight the 2 climate strikes, which were very much, which bring very much optimism to me, because I have the feeling that this is the kind of pressure we can make on politics, and there was a really broad media coverage on the climate strikes, and this has not been like that in the previous COPs. And I think if there are very critical young messages and young voices, then the media will also be more carefully on watching the countries if they really deliver what they promise to us in the next years.
Absolutely, thank you very much for that. I think certainly talking about, it's interesting to talk about kind of the climate strikes, those moments of protest as those moments of optimism, again coming back to kind of those youth networks and that youth solidarity, and indeed just solidarity generally at the conference. I think that's really interesting. Sorry, I think I was just checking I wasn't making any additional sounds there. We've had a really interesting question from Julius in our audience, so thank you so much, Julius, for sending this through. I was wondering if, Melissa, I could sort of hijack your response to this question slightly to ask if I could put this question to you as well. So as well as kind of talking about your view on sort of maybe moments of progress and optimism at COP26, I was wondering if you could start off by giving a bit of a comparison of this COP to previous COPs, because I know that you've attended several in the past. So Julius said that he attended COP26 and was told that it had been pretty different from previous COPs. Is that something that came through for you at all? And if so, how? And then also feel free to lead on to that kind of broader discussion of moments of progress and optimism at COP26. But thank you again, Julius, for sending that through.
Yeah, thank you. I will start with the question from Julia then. And yeah, I've been attending a COP since 2015. So I started my participation informally in COP20 in Peru, the one celebrated in Lima. But I really got involved like very actively for COP21, for the biggest COP in Paris, which was, from my experience and also for the results that we have, the Paris Agreement now, the landmark of the decade, no? So because what Julia asked, I will say that yes, there are differences. For example, you already mentioned, Michael and Prayank, you already mentioned something like, for example, this lack of, or the problem with accessing the spaces for negotiation. So this specifically was one big important point, was an issue actually, because observers or even more than one member of every committee of every nation was not possible to attend the negotiations. What in the past was different. At least 3-4 persons were able to be part of negotiations of every nation, of every group. So then it could, be more like fair in the sense of give the voices of many different actors. I'm listening.
Sorry, yeah, I think there's a slight sound coming through. So if I could just like ask the audience to make sure your microphones are all muted, because I don't think it is coming from you, Melissa. I wouldn't worry. Just keep talking.
Okay, yeah.
I think it's only come through momentarily, and I really want to hear more about this kind of comparison.
Okay, yeah. So apart from this point, actually, in my perspective, I guess what was different also was all these procedures that we need to follow every day. With, in my opinion, and for people, for experience of people that I was also talking with, there were at least every day we were spending at least 1.5 hours in order to get through the stage 1, to present the documents, and then there were many things, at least 1.5 hours for sure, that we were investing on just on that. So we were also very overwhelmed some days, because there were huge lines, huge quiz to get into, and at the end also the spaces what we wanted to attend, to be participating in not in negotiation, we were not able to attend. So it was a bit unfair for that. Actually, this is, in my opinion, the biggest difference between the COP 21, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So of course, this was already, presented by many organizations, specifically observers. But also trying to be fair and equally, in my opinion, I also saw many participation of youth organizations, also indigenous communities from many zones around the globe. So also was interesting for me. I never experienced so much, to be honest. There were many groups participating. There were probably I'm following also the Django group. That was the big constituency of youth for the negotiations, and I unfortunately didn't hear from them so much because of the problem to get access to the spaces in the blue zone. So it was a bit complex in the past. Green and blue zone, they were both almost attached, together. And we were able to go easily from green to blue, but this time it was almost impossible because you already were investing so much time to just get into one zone that it was not possible to really think about going out and go to the green zone and see what the other activities were happening. So in my opinion, this was the main difference.
Definitely, you had to kind of choose. I heard that from other people at COP26 as well. You had to choose. Once you were in the blue zone, you stayed in the blue zone or you left the blue zone for the day because it just wasn't accessible to kind of like dip in and out, which has, just a mountain of accessibility issues, which I believe, did those stem fundamentally from COVID-19 and kind of there not being alternative arrangements put in to kind of mitigate the falls in accessibility that resulted from the COVID measures? Because Prayank was talking, about this kind of like continual testing as well. It seems perhaps that those measures were put in, Melissa, do you think I am right? Were those measures kind of put in place because of COVID-19, but then there wasn't accessibility measures put in place to kind of mitigate the impact of those COVID measures?
Yeah, of course. They were both. We all understood that they were it was necessary to have, to measure, but this is the difference. Just of course, I'm agree with all the proceedings. We all signed it also declaration of participating in this kind of process. So of course it was fair. We were in a difficult times with COVID, and so we didn't have other chance, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Really, really interesting to hear from your experience in this year and also years gone by. Paula, could you kind of wrap up our sort of this section of the session then in terms of discussing sort of progress and or optimism at COP26, as I say, whether in kind of climate policy more generally or more in kind of the NGO civil society space?
No, absolutely. I think it's a very interesting topic to talk about, especially in the context of COP26. Talking about optimism and progress, it's very odd, especially after the widespread criticism that obviously COP received for so many reasons. And I think it's kind of always having to count the slight achievements and then the great things that were missing and lacking within the negotiations and the results. So for instance, talking about policies on reduction of coal or the factual promises in the field of climate finance that some saw as huge progress. Obviously, many cannot find optimistic just due to the fact that they're still too little too late and really not encompassing greater issues and much bigger promises and actual achievements that have to be made. But I think I would agree with some of the speakers that have spoken before me when they talk about the importance of also the making the big announcements and kind of the setting the targets that are still seen as way too little progress, but definitely held up kind of a level of like something that states and politicians need to stand up for because of the promises that I have made. They still raise a standard that before wasn't there. And I think if anything, COP26 was able to raise the standard of some questions that before weren't even asked. And while that is not hugely great, it is still something. And I think it's overwhelmingly because of the work that was done, not even within COP and the Blue Zone, but outside of it, and the importance that all the discussion around COP in the months leading up to it and just right outside within Glasgow were happening in the time really enabled the progress in kind of target setting to be made, even if so slight at the end. And from a more like personal experience, I think there was some level of optimism to be taken in regards to like the attitudes of some politicians with youth representatives, for instance. Frans Timmermans, only in the week that I was there, held at least 3 youth roundtables with young people from across different constituencies, and like spoke really openly about different policies and work that was being done. And while that is not the defining moment of the EU role at COP, it definitely shows that at least there was a moment of optimism to see more frank dialogue that was otherwise quite absent, in my opinion, throughout. So little steps here and there, but I think, as I said before, I think it's really hard to talk about optimism in the context of COP26. We can maybe now hope to talk about it in the context of COP27, but yeah.
No, I think that's completely reasonable. I think it's also very interesting and completely right, as you said, that we tend to put COPs on a bit of a pedestal and think of them as sort of defining moments in climate policy. And Paula, you quite rightly raised the hard work that goes on all the time to underpin the work that goes on at COPs, to try and get those, to try and push COPs further and the actual policy developments there further. If we could then move on to our next section, discussing the limitations, the failures, the disappointments of COP26. I know that we've just had a really interesting looking question from Barbara. I'm just going to give it a quick read through after I introduce someone to have a chat, and then we'll answer it in just a moment, if that's okay. Barbara, thank you very much for sending your message through. So we've been touching on the kind of disappointments of COP26 a bit already, but now I wanted to open the floor to discuss the greatest limitations, the greatest failures of COP26, and perhaps with an eye to talking about whether we can see them being remedied in COP27 at all, but really what were we disappointed by at COP26? Again, an incredibly broad question to put to you when I'm giving you a couple of minutes each to discuss it. But nonetheless, of course, we can't be all encompassing, but just your perspective right now to give a little bit of your insights. Melissa, I was wondering if you could start us off with that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, to be honest, in my opinion, or for what also I've been following throughout these 2 weeks, but afterwards too, I mean, I guess the big failure was the point of the finance, because before it started COP26, we were all pointing out that the finance this year was the most important subject to discuss and to agree on. So how to close the gap of the $100 billion every year for adaptation, loss and damage, and all of what the Paris Agreement has to achieve. But unfortunately, they didn't achieve, or they didn't agree on this, so we are still following for the next year. And this is becoming, in my opinion, that I'm following for the past 5 years, like a routine, no? So they leave the hardest topic for the last hours, and just saying, yeah, the next year we are gonna continue with this and probably find something like an agreement. So this is really a disappointment, because all of them knew that this was a very important target. And because of that, in my opinion, I also feel that the aside topics that were touched this year, or in the journey to this COP26, like coal phasing, cars, like net zero targets, and the trees, and how to reduce deforestation. Yeah, this was coming up as a way to, to fill the gap, or like kind of, I don't know how to call it, this like sharing the vision of the main topic that was finance and loss and damage and adaptation plans on that. So this is my personal point of view, and this is for me why we must continue pushing out this agenda, or through our governance or our politicians in all of the countries.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Again, I'm going to open Barbara's question up to the floor. Any of you feel free to jump in. If you're concerned about overlapping with each other, don't worry, just start talking. And then if you kind of overcut one another, I'll go back to I'll go back to each of the speakers if you wanted to speak. But Barbara, again, thank you very much for your comment. And she said that, Michael pointed out the media did report on the protest in Glasgow, and said that that kind of coverage was, in her view, quite sort of quite unique, that the amount of media attention given to the protests outside Glasgow. But I think, and Barbara, indeed, please message me if you think I'm summarizing this incorrectly. But I think what I can take from her comment is perhaps a reflection on whether it was a failure of COP26 that we didn't, or I say we, that it wasn't further discussed that pandemics will become more likely as we go forward into the climate crisis. And, we're talking about kind of, we missed COP26 originally in 2020 due to the pandemic. There were limitations on accessibility put in place again this year due to the pandemic. Was it a failure of COP26 that kind of presence of pandemics wasn't made explicit in climate policy and climate negotiations as well, because that will become more likely as we go forward into the climate crisis. So yeah, a question to put to any of you if you have any thoughts on that. Go on, Prayank.
I can take a quick crack, and I'll be quick. So I think on this specific question of whether pandemics will prolong or not, there is no shying away from the fact that this is just the beginning, and there will be more pandemics in the future, because there's zoonotics. More infections will more likely to happen. But what's more important is that the underlying issue is that we have pushed nature to an extent that now we need to redefine that relationship. We need to become more sustainable in the way we grow our food, in the way our supply chains are managed, in the way we are treating different species on the planet. And that's a larger issue. And on that front, I would say that this COP witnessed a large amount of focus on nature and nature-based solutions, which usually is missing from COPs. Just like this COP was the first COP to include coal in the official document, nature received a lot of attention tracked to dialogues between governments and civil society, which usually doesn't. Does that mean that indigenous groups also receive the same kind of attention? No. But at the same time, if you're talking about pandemics and the biological correlations, I would say that the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP16, which happened, COP16 or 15, which happened 2 months ago, is equally important. Because that speaks about the Earth's plan or the humanity's plan to protect 30% of biodiversity by 2030, and those are very important things. But I think I would just like to pause at that, and I think Michael also wanted to make a statement. But I just wanted to say that it's not required, or it was not always feasible for negotiators to rope in pandemics within climate negotiations, because these negotiations are very focused on the UNFCCC framework. We already had 10 things which are not able to be resolved. So something which is more suitable for the UN General Assembly or Security Council may not feature at the climate conference. For example, the link between climate, migration, and security is something that does not get included within the scope of the negotiations. It was a question asked to the IPCC in one of the plenary panels that, hey, what is the statistic on rising heat waves and migration? IPCC very clearly said it's not within our mandate. So I think these negotiations, if they stick to what they are looking at, is a success of its own kind. But yes, as humanity, as negotiators, we do realize that pandemics can prolong, and we need to really fix this by changing the way we approached lifestyles.
Thank you so much, Prayank. That's really interesting. Yeah, Michael, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thank you for raising the question, Barbara. I'm totally. I also have the opinion that the linkage between health and pandemics and the climate crisis is totally underrepresented in the public discourse. And as you said, Prayank, also security and climate. I mean, there are so many linkages between topics which are broadly discussed in the media and in the society, and on the other side, climate change and the climate crisis, but we do not make the linkage. And the question is, okay, now we have the problem, we see the problem, but who is responsible for making it better, for raising this kind of linkage and discussion? And I think it's us. It's on the one hand us, the young people, on the other hand, the scientists. But we now talking here do not have a direct influence, or we cannot change from one day to the other how scientists behave. And also we cannot influence how media behave, but in the long term, we can enable them and motivate them to talk more about these linkages. And Fridays for Future, for example, we are certainly a kind of a agenda setting stakeholder. If we would make campaigns on health and climate crisis, then it would be a bigger topic, at least in Europe, in the media. But yeah, unfortunately, we haven't done so too, because we had other focuses. So it's also the question how we ourselves can influence the discourse. That's a very important one, because I think there are so many scientists who have good ideas on that and who would be willing to talk in the media about these things. We just have to enhance it. And to the previous question, what I would want to add is Article 6. Article 6 is a very key point in the negotiations about the rule book, which was decided in Glasgow. And it makes me a bit, I'm somehow feared that with Article 6, which allows that countries make trades with emission reductions, countries now could start putting less effort in climate reduction within their country borders, but rather try to buy emission reductions from other countries. This can be a very critical negative impact. It is not clear yet how it will evolve and whether it will have a net positive or a net negative impact. But yeah, I'm quite feared that this could be a very bad outcome also of COP26, because there are better negotiation outcomes within this article, but there are also quite critical ones where, for example, yeah, that's nearly all of the emissions which are reduced in one country can be shifted to the other country. And if you would take out at least a share of, I don't know, 30%, for example, then it would have a way better impact on the climate.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Michael. And thank you also for tagging your answer onto my previous question as well. It was very neatly done. And thank you again to Barbara for raising such an interesting topic, which took us across, the themes of biodiversity and nature loss as well. Exactly the kind of question you want to receive at a webinar. So thank you very much for your interesting point. I want to have all the speakers just have a quick opportunity to finish off that question on kind of like limitations of COP26. And then I'll ask you each to give a very quick answer on how youth can go about making change themselves in the wake of in the run up to COP27, I should say. So Paula, quickly, your view on sort of major limitations or failures at COP26.
Yes, I'll try and be quick and summarize kind of what I think are the main ones to be noticed. I think one on policy that was really, really important was the changing from phasing out to phasing down fossil fuels, and kind of the impact that had on obviously the general outcomes of COP26, but also how the feeling of success was clearly diminished once all delegations and EU representative, etc., were coming out. I thought that had a really huge impact. Another one is about accessibility. I think a big limitation was about how easy, or might I say hard, COP was actually to access for many people, be it because of difficulties to getting visas to the UK, or be it because it was hard to be able to reach the UK even with a visa due to the difference in COVID vaccines and the general lack of accessibility of that from people that came especially from the global south. I think that it was a big failure that COP showed in being unable to actually be very representative. And obviously, I think another big limitation was surrounding young people. the fact that it was only one day really dedicated to youth, rather than kind of driving a feeling that young people are part of the conversation throughout all topics of discussion that made it happen at COP. I think there was a big factor there that also relates to the fact that young people were obviously not very overwhelmingly represented at COP, but also the fact that it seemed like the message sent was, oh, there's a day for you, but everything else doesn't matter for you. Well, as a matter of fact, everything matters for us because we're so young and all of this is going to matter. And that being really the point of young people really driving a lot of the climate and environmental conversations the past year, making this a topic such importance worldwide. So I think I would say these three to be the main limitation that COP showed.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, yeah, a really kind of like resounding 3 limitations to take home there. I think the phase down versus phase out of coal got a lot of press coverage after COP26 as well. It's important to raise that, I think, because obviously with the Glasgow Climate Pact that had such an impact on the actual solid outcomes. Prayank, just before we move on to that final section quickly to give your roundups on looking to COP27, anything else that you'd like to add vis-a-vis kind of limitations and failures of COP26?
I mean, we can speak about limitations and failures, but now what's gone is gone. So I would like to save this time to address the next question, when the term comes.
That's wonderful. Yeah, do you want to take it away then, Prayank? I'm very happy for you to then lead on and talk about what can people do in the run up to COP27 to empower themselves.
Sure, I'll be quick so that all speakers can get a chance. Firstly, I think I want to reiterate that COPs and platforms like COPs, which are happening at the international relations level, are only for the UN community and heads of states to make important announcements and come to great or important decisions that then can be implemented at the micro level, at the domestic level. So they set the direction, but the real work happens before and after a COP, right? So when we are talking about youth's role, I think it's about ground up action. When we are talking about active citizenry, or we are talking about municipal corporations, we're looking at urban justice, sanitation, health and climate. The work has to happen on the ground. The COPs are just like a crown on top, but you need the palace and the kingdom to be built. So I think the next step is, whether it is COP27 or any other platform, the youth has to mobilize more and more people and has to push itself beyond protests to solutions. Not that protests are not important, but they can yield a significant amount of pressure if they are followed up with action. And we have youth across the world who are entrepreneurs, innovators, and coming up with solutions to address different problems of their communities, right? And Melissa is one such person here. She's an environmental engineer now. So I think we need to promote more and more solutions, and it has to be more micro and ground up, because ultimately as Michael mentioned, you are or as Paula mentioned that, you are the COP and you wonder, what are you doing? What is your purpose here? Are you solving the planet by coming here? But if you work on the ground, you're definitely contributing more meaningfully. So I think look at areas around you and try to solve problems around and connect and mobilize more people and communicate climate change, make it a mainstream issue.
Thank you so much for that. I will hand over to Melissa as our resident environmental engineer who's doing work on the ground and following on from Prayank's words.
Thank you very much. And I will also encourage, all people or you that are following and that will see this video. Because of my personal experience, I also started very, very young, and how I felt that I was like overcoming and achieving things. I guess it's important to first of all join organizations, join even smaller. It is important to create a big impact, and it's also to make create and make visible your work, because in that way the government and the people who are in the decision making sphere are gonna see, and also because you will empower another youth, like young people like you. And it is very important, especially I see these examples in countries like Peru or Latin America and in Africa and Asia too, that there are 100 millions of initiatives, entrepreneurs and people who have an idea. And how they are acting. They are acting individual, of course, but I guess the important thing is to go a step go to the next step, to the next level, and try to aggregate and act in collectiveness, because I guess in that way they will find more energy to overcome, to fight towards their dreams and to the aims that they want to achieve. So this is my experience, and there are many organizations around the globe that are promoting participation in COP27. So I will for sure encourage them to have a look on internet. ClimaTalk, for example, they are presenting all of the information necessary to know about it, to be prepared for what is going to happen in the next COP. And yeah, so this is my message.
Yeah, no, thank you. The themes of collaborating and getting involved are very much coming through in this discussion, I feel. I think we'll run over by a couple of minutes just to hear those closing thoughts from Michael and Paula in turn. So Paula, do you want to take it away with your thoughts on what people can do now?
Yeah, I think it's really also a lot of what it's been said, right, about the kind of getting engaged. I think there's so many youth groups across the world that work on environmental and climate topics, way more than I realized before I got involved myself. And I think there's really a lot of power to be seen in that. And I think young people are now trying to make all these topics more and more accessible, but at a higher quality, and kind of discussing real policy with kind of real implications. And much of this content now is online. I mean, this webinar, obviously, and so many more that ClimaTalk organizes. So many are also delivered by Youth and Environment Europe, and so many that we're working on. And I think that is really important to just, sometimes so many things are available closer to when we think they may be. And finally, I also think that connecting to people is super important. Like as a human individual, I think that was very important for me at COP. And I would definitely recommend that to anyone who's working on climate issues or wants to start working on it, because it's very powerful to be connected to others.
Yeah, absolutely, completely agree. Michael, do you want to take the floor to finish off with your thoughts on that?
I would certainly agree with my previous speakers that we must, as young people, join up and become engaged in climate, in pushing climate politics to a level where we can still achieve the climate targets, which are set by the Paris Agreement. However, I think we should be careful with just joining any organization which is doing anything on climate action, because I think the problem is that we do not have united forces, and we make a lot of stuff which is not, which does not really have a proper theory of change. So we should think twice before we join an organization, and we should always think about how we can have a maximum of pressure on politics, because as we see, the climate crisis is accelerating more or less exponentially, and so also our action must rise exponentially. And I think the biggest possibility which we have, at least I'm talking from a European perspective, is still the usual media. It's not social media, but it's media. I think that we cannot solve any problem without the help of the media, but we have a big influence on the media because they are super interested in what young people think and what young people do. And we can, for example, bring to the media the urgency of the climate crisis itself, but also, as you mentioned, Prayank, the climate solutions. We can also amplify the voices of people from the global south in the media, but we should not, we should always have a focus there, because I have made, for example, those kind of youth participation, youth engagement in very different forms, partly very blurry forms of youth participation. And I don't have the feeling that we can change a lot behind closed doors. I think the fight which we have to make is in the public, and media are certainly the very focus and the very center of the public debate.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that. I've kept you all audience and speakers alike 5 minutes longer than I promised I would. So all it leaves me is to say thank you very much to our speakers for those fascinating insights I can't thank you enough for each insight that you've given, but it's been really enriching to hear your experiences at COP26 and just generally about youth climate activism and climate policy. Thank you also to our audience for sticking with us for 5 minutes longer than planned and being here with us this evening to talk about climate activism. So now I will simply put up our closing slide and say thank you all very, very much for attending. ClimaTalk is going to be on a break for the next month or so, so you'll see less output from us, but we will be back in middle of January with more events and more articles to come. You will know that we'll be back. We have a lot to come next year. So in the meantime, as I say, all that leaves is for me to say thank you very much to our speakers again for their brilliant insights and to you all for attending. Yeah, thank you very much.